Of the various interworking elements in Sayonara Zetsubou-Sensei, the surreal approach to dialogue stands out as especially significant. Although a certain circularity and incongruity through dialogue may be standard within the comedy genre, Zetsubou-Sensei moves beyond this conventional expectation, forming the basis that determines every other constituent part. In order to understand this approach to language, which seems intent on defying understanding or explanation, Zetsubou-Sensei's direction and use of language will be studied through three historical examples: the ancient Taoist text of Zhuangzi, the Dadaist movement, which emerged during World War I, and the absurdist works of Eugene Ionesco from the second half of the 20th century. Although not one of the main focuses of this study, Hiroki Azuma does provide an important insight into grounding the conception of reality that connects these disparate authors. Azuma's 2001 work on otaku refers to a scene in the OVA Megazone 23, in which the protagonist discovers the reality he lives in is a simulacrum of 1980s Tokyo created by a supercomputer. The reason provided for choosing this time in particular in the computer's articulation is that, for the people, it was the most peaceful era. Azuma argues that this constructed version of reality extended beyond the celluloid image, and that on a deeper level, the 80s in Japan constituted a fiction, but one of convenience and comfort. Once the bubble economy came and went within the decade, the 80s became reconfigured in the wider consciousness as a site of nostalgic memory before the emergence of a lost decade.
国民すべてがイケイケどんどんポジティブだった結果がこれだ。何人の人間が失業し、何人の社長が樹海へ消えたことか。
今君が聞いているイケイケどんどんの小室哲哉も将来どうなるかわからないよ。
もう少しネガティブな発想ができる者がいればバブルは防げたかもしれないのです。
Taken within the context of Azuma's overarching theory of the dismantling social conception of the grand narrative, the term lost generation denotes not just the loss of economic growth, but also comes to encompass a loss of meaning through the erasure of ideology as a force in defining people's lives, as by the end of the 80s, Japanese society moved away from serious political engagement, replaced by a path of individualized consumption. This loss of meaning comprises a recognizable presence in Sayonara Zetsubou-Sensei, immediately recognizable by the fact that it is set not in the year 2007 when it aired, but rather Showa 80, providing a realization of Azuma's theory, in which the 80s and Showa period are allowed to exist indefinitely. But the Showa period of Zetsubou-Sensei is one of unreality. The image of Japan that the series portrays does not follow as an extension of the optimism of the 80s, as its sense of location is a deliberately theatrical and artificial one that has been suspended in time. When looking at the writing and dialogue in Sayonara Zetsubou-Sensei, its intertextuality and meta-referentiality coalesce and interconnect into its most distinctly recognizable quality. Lucky Star, by way of contrast, aired the same year, and incorporated a broadly comparable style of referentiality into its writing, but in the case of Lucky Star, the scope of references is limited to other anime, games, and products within the otaku sphere. Zetsubou-Sensei distinguishes itself from its contemporaries by referencing not just other anime, but classical mythology, literature, political or historical figures, and finding ways to integrate all these different, seemingly random cultural artifacts into a comprehensible entity that still addresses modern concerns. Of all the names that Itoshiki mentions, Zhuangzi stands out as one particularly intricate figure for trying to establish a guiding presence to understand the series. Profound comedians have always been hard to come by, funny philosophers perhaps even more so. To enter into this work attributed to Zhuangzi is to find oneself roused and enraptured by its intellectual and spiritual depth, but also by its provocative humour. The specific passage from Zhuangzi that Itoshiki refers to is the most well-known episode from the text. Zhuangzi narrates having awoken from a dream in which he was a butterfly, and upon his recollection of consciousness, was for a moment unsure if he was dreaming that he was a butterfly, or if a butterfly was dreaming that he was Zhuangzi. He recognises that between the self he occupies now as Zhuangzi and the self as a butterfly, there must be some kind of distinction to separate the two states, although he remains unsure of how he might define that distinction. His investigation of a dilemma raised by the dream is centred around the dissolution of boundaries, which becomes a question of epistemology, to which Zhuangzi reaches the same conclusion as Kant, that knowledge must come from experience. What separates Zhuangzi from Kant is that he argues that reality itself is inherently paradoxical, and any system built on logical consistency will fail to address many critical aspects of human experience. Zhuangzi deliberately avoids a commitment to any comprehensive ideological system, and his dialectical investigations lead to upstanding contradictions, rather than conclusions. Kant's approach depends on several assumptions that are not at all a part of Zhuangzi's presentation. First, there is Kant supposing that the faculties of reason and understanding function identically in all of us. The rejection of our ability to know about any such university is the key leitmotif of Zhuangzi's entire text. Zhuangzi rejects such university, along with the concomitant shared canons of validity, even of myself at one moment and myself at another moment, as in the famous story of his dream of being a butterfly, or was it a butterfly's dream of being Zhuangzi? Because I do not see things, or reason, in the same way at all times, there are deep discontinuities in the modalities of my experiencing that cannot be embraced within a single overarching system of adjudicating knowledge. Any such system would itself belong and be limited to one of the modalities. The American philosopher C.I. Lewis once asked, did the sage of Königsberg have no dreams, finding no room to account for the possibilities offered by dreams within the Kantian system. In the Zhuangzi, dreams regularly appear as a narrative device to reveal truths that remain otherwise undefined or obscured by historical reality, and it would not be excessive to suggest that it assigns equal importance to the two sides of existence, as it is experienced through waking life and through dreams. Rather than try and find a comprehensive framework to capture reality as it is typically defined, Zhuangzi advocates for a form of Dialetheism, which is a logical framework that allows for contradictory statements to both be true. When viewed under the lens of contemporary epistemology, the use of Dialetheism reveals itself as the most significant aspect of Zhuangzi's design, through its emphasis on the multi-layered nature of truth and perspective.
He's a very, very sharp debater. And it seems that he's fully conversant with a very sophisticated vocabulary of argumentation at the time. But he doesn't wear it on his sleeve. He uses it to dispose of people who want to assert that there are eternal verities, eternal truths that we should all follow. He makes the argument that things are relative, that what you think is right is relative to what you see from where you stand. Thus, the Moists, the followers of Mozi, look at the Confucians and say, you're wrong, and the Confucians look at the Moists and say, you're wrong. Neither one of them is right. They're just relative judgments from their various perspectives.
Zhuangzi's position acts on two interconnecting points. The first is the previously mentioned lack of consistency in judgment and experience, and the second comes from the insufficient nature of language to adequately convey the extent of thought. To use a word to try and capture its meaning is ultimately using one thing to signify another. A snare is there for the rabbits. When you get to the rabbit, you forget the snare. Words are there for the intent. When you get to the intent, you forget the words. Where can I find a man who has forgotten words, so I can have a word with him? This argument is then taken one point further, as Zhuangzi explicates how using one thing to signify something else is equivalent to using a non-point to make a point. You can use the active indication as an illustration of the unindicated that belongs to all indication, but that is no match for using the unindicated itself as an illustration of the unindicated that belongs to all indication. You can use a horse to show the non-horseness of a horse, but that is no match for using the non-horseness itself to show the non-horseness of horses. By highlighting and acknowledging the limits of language, Zhuangzi does not advance a form of obscurantism, but rather develops his argumentation to look at the standards that emerge from language's inherent view and question the legitimacy of their underlying conditions.
今先生、正解って言いましたよね。
は、言いましたが、それが何か？
正解なら間違いじゃないじゃないですか。
え？
あ
いや、それは言葉のあやで。
あ、間違い探しの正解って変な話ですよね。わかりました。間違いは発覚した時点で正解になるんですね。
え？
そうですよ。世の中にそうそう間違いなんてあるわけないですもの。
A practical demonstration of the concept of linguistic determinism is found in a passing exchange between the European philosophers Hobbes and Descartes, in which they both agreed that the only way to conceive of an act is through its subject, because within the European linguistic structure, a sentence without a subject is logically impossible, unlike in Japanese, where the most important point is a verb, and the subject does not have to appear in order for a sentence to make grammatical sense. It is from this difference in linguistic perception that the Japanese philosopher Nishida Kitaro was able to develop a conception of pure experience that occurs without a subject, and of seeing without a seer, a term that follows the same structure that Hobbes had considered logically impossible when he declared that it is not conceivable to think of thinking without a thinker. On the basis of this intrinsic difference in conception, Nishida's thought, which puts him in alignment with Zhuangzi, leads to a form of Dialetheism and anti-Cartesianism. Descartes proposed that cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, which changed the basis of Western philosophy as a whole. Since Descartes, philosophy does not have to start with a presumed extrinsic entity, for example a divinity or God. Instead, it is based on the self-evidence of a subject, and thus inaugurates the history of a dichotomy of subject and object, wherein the former dominates the latter. The moment the ego was declared the subject, all things with extension in the world became objects. Descartes' declaration was a seminal philosophical event, and man becoming subject and world becoming object are the two simultaneous dimensions of this event. Subsequently, the real world collapses in the apprehension of human beings who behave as subjects and is lost among endless terms. When human beings become the preordained starting point of epistemology, all meanings and values in the world are endowed and assumed by human beings, begging the question of whether human beings really are able to bear all of this. Indeed, the establishment of the I as subject has ensured man's transcendence rather than his mediocrity, and guaranteed the existence of an other world, which is above the empirical one and is eternal, infinite, rational and orderly. On the other hand, however, it has caused tension between I and the world, I and the other, and I and myself. It is through Dialetheism that the series' artificialized version of the Showa era is able to function, creating a conception of a Showa era that is both a representation of the past and present at the same time. This past-present dissolution is echoed in the Zhuangzi, with its own referencing of historical figures or pre-existing myths who exist in intercourse with the present author Zhuangzi, and by extension, creates a form of the past that is encountered through the present. With a Dialetheist approach comes a disregard for regular continuity and logic, which is what allows for Itoshiki to die multiple times throughout the series, including in the opening to each episode, but with no lasting consequence. By having Itoshiki die with its regularity, it also creates a grounding for Nishitani Keiji's comment that death stands infinitely nearer to us than life itself. The Zhuangzi's Dialetheism is expressed in multiple ways throughout the text, but its anti-Cartesian flavour is perhaps exemplified by this passage. There is a beginning, there is a not yet beginning to be a beginning, there is a not yet beginning to be a not yet beginning to be a beginning, there is being, there is non-being, there is a not yet beginning to be non-being, there is a not yet beginning to be a not yet beginning to be non-being. Suddenly, there is being and non-being, but between this being and non-being, I don't really know which is being and which is non-being. Now I have just said something, but I don't know whether what I have said has really said something, or whether it hasn't said something. Here, Zhuangzi articulates the dissolution of boundaries in a manner that evokes the sharp wit, and importantly the sense of humour of the gravedigger from Hamlet.
Whose grave's this, sirrah?
Mine, sir. Oh, fit of clay for to be made for such a guest as me.
I think it be thine indeed, for thou liest in't.
You lie out on, sir, and therefore it is not yours. For my part, I do not lie in't, and yet it is mine.
Thou dost lie in't to be in't, and say 'tis thine. 'Tis for the dead, not for the quick, therefore thou liest.
'Tis a quick lie, sir. 'Twill away again from me to you.
The gravedigger, also, would agree with Nishitani Keiji that he is standing closer to death than life.
著名な方がおっしゃいました。人生に正解などないと。
はあ、
つまり人生には間違いしかないということですよ。
そういう意味で言ったんじゃないと思いますが。
The anti-Cartesianism of Zetsubou-Sensei manifests itself on an ideological level, as has been covered through the Zhuangzi, but it entrenches and further exemplifies this idea by developing an anti-Cartesian approach to its visual direction. Through its use of visuals, Zetsubou-Sensei echoes the Zhuangzian position on the relativist and dialetheist nature of reality, and suggests Thomas Lamar's theory of radical perspectivalism, with its rejection of a Cartesian rationality, instead emphasizing the subjectivity of experience through the use of perspective and framing.
ここは先生のインナースペース、つまり心の中です。ペリーさんは先生の心を開こうとしているうちにその中に入ってしまったんです。
心の中、つまりここをどうにかすれば彼は心を開くですね。
甘いですね。
おう、心の中に本人が。
Instead of using a standard flat perspective to govern the universe it depicts, the stylized distortion, deliberate use of discontinuity, intermixing of disparate forms of animation with live-action footage and with each other, all interact to invoke the mental decay and fracturing of its characters' mental states. The one-point perspective of Cartesianism implies an ideal viewing position from which all phenomena can be understood and accounted for. Zetsubou-Sensei's design is predicated on one point, which is to dismantle this conception. Various characters will intermittently take on the authoritative position of a narrator, in which they will guide the viewer through their observation and listing items that exist to support their preordained conclusion from those observations. In this manner, the series disregards Cartesian rationality, which would imply that only one position can accurately represent reality. Via its own deliberate subjectivity, the series suggests that there is not one reality, but only an individual's comprehension, of which one cannot be assumed to be more true than another. A small consciousness cannot keep up with a vast consciousness. Short duration cannot keep with long duration. How do we know? The morning mushroom knows nothing of noontide. The winter cicada knows nothing of the spring and the autumn. This is what is meant by short duration. In southern Chu, there is a tree called Mingling, for which 500 years are as a single spring, and another 500 years are as a single autumn. One issue arises from his equalised valuing of perspective, conveyed by Zhuangzi when he makes the argument that arguments cannot establish anything, which by extension also means that argument itself is unable to establish anything. If no argument is able to establish anything, then the most effective position to hold is that of a non-argument, represented through Itoshiki's neurotic resignation and denial. The anti-Cartesianism of its Showa-era premise may theoretically lead to a sort of freedom, by allowing the individual to create their own reality. But as one sees, with the power of freedom and infinite possibility, Itoshiki only finds one conclusion to be appropriate. Three things are the harvest of our education: poor eyesight, a yawning disgust with everything that once existed, and an incapacity to face the future. Although the moment of mass hysteria known as World War I constitutes an important element in the birth of Dadaism, some histories oversimplify the matter by treating it not as the proximate cause, but the only cause. Underlying the outbreak of war was the culmination of a lingering cultural despair that had been laying dormant for decades. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy suggests that the pessimism found in Arthur Schopenhauer's writings from 1818 gave expression to the Dadaist attitude almost a full century before that movement came into being, and before World War I's industrial scale of slaughter had cast a shadow of doubt on the Hegelian and Marxist notion of history as a trajectory of continual positive progress. Dadaism came as a response to not just the events of 1914, but many concurrent decades of industrial modernity, and a national character that until that moment was still adherent to the Enlightenment-era idea of the individual as a rational and autonomous subject. In Germany, the phenomenon of cultural despair dated back to as early as the 1850s, and was only exacerbated by Bismarck's unification in 1871, which for our purposes coincides very closely in Japanese context to Commodore Perry's expedition in 1854 and the subsequent Meiji Restoration of 1868. Is there no soul in Germany that protests against the pleasure of being an heir to some 5,000 odd years, none that feels this inherited wealth impoverishes us because it oppresses us, because it forces us not to be ourselves? In 1916 Zurich, Hugo Ball founded Dadaism and gave it its name, and by 1918, independent movements had emerged in Paris, Berlin and New York, with Tokyo following their lead in 1920. Upon its arrival, Japanese Dadaists noted a similarity between Dadaism and the Eastern traditions of Taoism and Buddhism, with Takahashi Shinkichi suggesting that Dadaism was something of a Western translation and understanding of the concept of nothingness that appeared in Buddhism and the philosophy of Nishida Kitaro. While I would prefer to offer an equal treatment of both the European and Japanese sides of Dadaism, the overall scholarship on Japanese Dadaism is too insubstantial to allow for any sort of detailed analysis, and so this discussion will predominantly involve Dada's historical developments as they appeared in Europe. Dada was the outbreak of a revolt of vitality and rage, the result of the absurdity, the great Schweinerei of a stupid war. Young men, we came back from the war in a state of stupor, and our indignation needed an outlet. It found a natural outlet in violent attacks against the foundations of our civilization which had brought about the war, against language, syntax, logic, literature, painting. The surreal style of Arthur Rimbaud may be identified as the origin point for the Dadaist strain of language. The movement disengaged from the popular theories of grand narratives and psychoanalysis, and considered a process by which one understands and engages with meaning as a concept itself as more intrinsically dynamic than traditional doctrine allowed for. By recognizing that words can be manipulated through distortive practice, Dadaism extrapolated that meaning itself as a broader category has the capacity to be altered in the same way. As language constitutes the most fundamental aspect of a pre-existing consensus for logic, reason, and the society's accepted values, it was precisely through the uncritical use of language in the years of cultural despair, through which modern society had endorsed rather than challenged distortions to logic and value. As it was for Rimbaud, the response was to take this basis to welcome the fragmented aspects of the human condition. Works like Francis Picabia's portrait of fellow Dadaist Tristan Tzara and Raoul Hausmann's font design from Dadaco took the concept of intelligibility in language or artistic representation, found the extent of the boundaries that informed these concepts, and then took to dismantling not just ideas of sensibility as traditionally conceived, but the concept of taste and art as a comprehensive whole.
どうでもいいつまんないことを大げさに言うな。
世間に反目してどうでもいいことを大々的に言うことに決めたのです。
In Germany, the end of World War I brought home a combined 7 million men with debilitating disabilities or injuries. The image of a modern armoured soldier as a symbolic force of power, as he was idolised in Erzjunga, had been dismantled beyond repair. Despite the advent of reconstructive plastic surgery, the post-war Weimar government was largely unprepared to deal with a society whose structures and citizens alike existed in a broken array. Can you see the wretched ones, your brothers, who can no longer live, yet who are not entirely dead either, and now stand in the streets as memorials to your guilt? The collective experience and cultural memory of industrial warfare had revealed the frailty of the human body through mutilation and displacement, and it was on the irreconcilable ground of the interwar period that Dadaism pursued a distinctive theme of visual disruption, responding to the prevailing mood of the times with its own form of displacement via the creation of hybrid assemblages. This brings us to Zetsubou-Sensei, whose Dadaist sensibility is most apparent in the Czechoslovakian-style openings directed by Gikudan Inukari, with their focus on hybrid assemblage and a decentered and distorted visual approach. The hybrid assemblage of an artificially constructed body, built from incompatible or broken parts, is suggestive of the inability to reconcile with false values and a concomitant rejection of the ideology that presupposes a logical unity between the body, the mind, and the self. The image of a human form is gradually disappearing from the painting of the times, and all objects appear only in fragments. This is one more proof of how ugly and worn the human countenance has become, and of how all objects of our environment have become repulsive to us. Within the first few seconds, the confrontation with World War II era bombers and the IJN flag may parallel Dada's wartime origins, but the overall image is one that converges history and the present into a singular moment, where Meiji era Dutch studies and shibari find themselves tied up with traditional forms of art and architecture, together with meta-referentiality to the series' other openings. The placement of these motifs alongside each other is suggestive of a distinctly Japanese iconography, a presence further invoked through the recurring presence of the national flag and the phrase "Made in Japan." But Made in Japan markings hold a special significance, existing in a situational context that deprives them of their intended function. Instead of providing a form of orientation for the viewer, they confer the opposite, as they are always placed at an opposite angle or positioned in such a way that their standard textual function is compromised, overlapping with other instances of themselves, being placed upside down or splitting across the frame, evoking Hugo Ball's comment that the Dadaist no longer believes in the comprehension of things from one point of view. Shibari can also be counted within this category of Japanese tradition and iconography, where it advances the Dadaist notion of bodily displacement in response to national trauma. As a sexually charged activity that involves ropes and suspension, it firstly relates itself to Itoshiki and his associated imagery, whereby his own use of rope makes for a Freudian interrelation between the two acts of shibari and suicide, and the inherent drives that instigate both sexual life and death. More broadly, the seifuku, over which the ropes of shibari are applied, also holds significance as an object itself, as its orientation and function is always presented through distortive means. The seifuku is attached to bodies that are multifarious in their construction, with missing parts that they exchange with incompatible organic and manufactured objects, creating an orchestra of movement and mutilation that appears through the process of collage. What is collage? Simple hallucination, according to Rambo, the Misesu Whiskey Marine, according to Max Ernst. It is something like the alchemy of a visual image, the miracle of a total transfiguration of beings and objects, with or without modification of their physical or anatomical appearance. Collage provides a basis for a visual image characterised by an intermixing of different forms and art styles, which creates an overloading of available space, whereby the image's individual parts conflict and interject with each other, further compromising the readability of a frame. With such an assault on the senses, Dadaism removes the assumptions of cinematic language, and the viewer is deprived of any clear direction through which to orient their perception, and the assumed cinematic continuity between the development of ideas and context through concurrent imagery becomes lost. Displacement also relates the editing style to the recurring use of fragmented objects, as it first suggests the idea of attempting to reconcile and understand a fragmented part of a comprehensive whole through the use of mutilated bodies, and it then actualises this idea through its fragmented editing. The editing process deliberately highlights the artificiality of the medium by drawing attention to the construction process with the insertion of film decay, digital glitch effects, or creating a second layer through which it is perceived. Especially relevant to the notion of artificiality is the use of anachronistic running film reels. Without a larger truth or narrative through which to perceive its individual parts, the only aspect through which the viewer is able to have any comprehension is found in the individual image, and with the erasure of meaning, the insistence on objects themselves accentuates the sensory and perceptive qualities of experience, which provides a directorial freedom, creating a sense of pure energy and distortion through the overwhelming layers of imagery that Dadaism constructs, and also through those that it mutilates and destroys. Moving on, the final point of comparison is with the Romanian-French playwright Eugene Ionesco, with a particular focus on his first work from 1948, The Bald Soprano. Unlike in the preceding section, a detailed explanation of the aftermath of World War II as a social context that instigated Ionesco's writing is not necessary, as everything that was already said pertaining to the loss of a grand narrative in the midst of World War I is equally applicable, with only one point of differentiation, which is the solemn recognition that we had all done it before. This is the most piercing aspect of The Bald Soprano, which is categorised as absurdist theatre, although Ionesco consistently rejected this term, preferring to call his work the theatre of derision. Ionesco claims that in The Bald Soprano, the characters do not exist as people, but mechanisms to present ideas of language, and from this basis, Ionesco constructs a world that is devoid of communication or relationships between individuals. Absurd drama subverts logic and relishes the unexpected and logically impossible. According to Sigmund Freud, there is a feeling of freedom we can enjoy when we are able to abandon the straitjacket of logic. In trying to burst the bounds of common logic and language, the absurd theatre tends to shatter the enclosing walls of the human condition itself. Our individual identity is defined by language. Having a name is the source of our separateness. The loss of logical language brings us toward a unity with living things. In being illogical, the absurd theatre is anti-rationalist. It negates rationalism because it feels that rationalist thought, like language, only deals with the superficial aspects of things. Nonsense, on the other hand, opens up a glimpse of the infinite, offers intoxicating freedom, brings one into contact with the essence of life, and is a source of marvellous comedy. Although there is plenty of commonality between Ionesco's overall bibliography, the decision to focus on The Bald Soprano comes from its unique ending, where its characters repeat the opening lines again from the beginning, and through the absurdist design, it remains unclear if they are aware of their past experience or not. This superficiality likens Ionesco's characters to the conventions of puppet theatre, as while puppets may resemble human beings, they are distinctly separate through their absence of human will or faculties of reason, and it is through this disconnect between external appearance and internal deprivation that guides Ionesco's work. The opening episode of the second season of Zetsubou-Sensei has Kafka and Itoshiki meeting again, speaking to each other in a way that mirrors their own first meeting, in a manner evocative of Ionesco's technique. This episode stands as a rejection of narrative continuity, an aspect of design previously discussed through Itoshiki's recurring deaths, but here the lack of continuity communicates to the viewer the impossibility of verbal communication between its characters. A responsive agitation and mounting despair, when confronted with this impossibility, draws him closely to Berenger, a recurring protagonist across Ionesco's later works who, like Itoshiki, finds himself overwhelmed by the irrationality of his environment. This sense of irrationality is self-evident in the anachronistic Showa-era setting, but through the character design, each individual becomes a manifestation of Hiroki Azuma's database of moe elements. Each character has their appearance and personality defined by their name, thereby embodying classic moe traits. Azuma sees the otaku database as an exercise in postmodernism, in which the viewer disregards the grand narrative to focus on a character. Using the example of Sakura from Urusei Yatsura, an ahistorical fusion of a Japanese Miko with Western fantasy, Azuma says the otaku chooses not to care about this contradiction. Zetsubou-Sensei differs from Azuma's theory, as it deliberately raises its contradictions to the forefront, and then explores the existential malaise that comes from living in the self-contradictory landscape that it creates. A reasonable anxiety about the behaviours and values of the social world they live in is a trait common to both Itoshiki and Ionesco's Berenger, but this aspect of the overall story finds itself subsumed by the world at large, as the scale compounds further upon itself, often to an apocalyptic or otherwise farcical conclusion. Berenger and Itoshiki question the rift between the subjective and the objective, in cases where personal opinion or group identity threaten to override universal law. This leads them to a confrontation with the most intimately subjective of all human experiences, which is death itself, and despite the religious undertones, they come out the other side feeling subdued rather than enlightened. Ionesco was often dismissed in order to elevate one of his contemporaries, the German socialist Bertolt Brecht. One illuminating example came from an instance in which the critic Kenneth Tynan met Ionesco and proceeded to tell him that he could become the greatest living playwright if only he became Brechtian, to which Ionesco pointed out that if he followed this advice, he could only at best hope to be the second best playwright behind Brecht himself. While Brecht's works were informed by his Marxist beliefs, Ionesco avoided letting any kind of ideological system define himself. I speak neither to the aged nor the young, I speak to people, to say what. I wonder whether I said anything at all, and if I'm still able to speak. I wonder whether I can provide answers to the questions I posit. I find myself in an absolutely chaotic state, desperate, at a loss, and I have no idea what I can hold on to. While Brecht's socialist messaging offered a way forward, Ionesco held no pretense about any kind of solution. Certainly, when interviewers asked Ionesco about his plays, there was no response he favoured more than I don't know. In Rhinoceros, his most famous play, Berenger finds himself increasingly isolated as everyone he knows succumbs to the disease of rhinoceritis. While the dominant reading of the play takes it to be a critique of wartime fascism, Ionesco has maintained that it is about ideological conformity as a whole, one that is applicable to conformity's mechanisms in a communist system as much as a fascist one.
Est-ce que parmi ceux, justement, de ces écrivains à message qui sont contre vous, est-ce que vous n'avez pas un illustre adversaire en Jean-Paul Sartre?
Oh.
Est-ce que c'est une querelle classique?
Oh, Jean-Paul Sartre. Oh, non, je ne veux pas en parler parce que je ne veux pas dire du mal de lui. Non, je...
Pour vous, c'est l'amphithéâtre?
Non, c'est l'homme qui cède à tout. C'est l'homme qui cède à tout. C'est l'homme qui écrit une philosophie inspirée de Heidegger, l'illustre, il croit que c'est le dernier mot de la pensée, et qui est tout près, qui était tout près en 38-39 d'être nazi. Enfin, les nazis sont... Enfin, d'être nazi, il aurait pu l'être. Il aurait pu l'être. Enfin, arrive la guerre, il vit tranquillement. Pendant la guerre, tout de suite après la guerre, l'Allemagne est vaincue et il redevient humaniste. L'existentialisme est un humanisme, dit-il. Et puis, après, la Russie devient très puissante, il devient très communisant, et dans son dernier livre, il se déclare ami du marxisme. Arrive la guerre, la révolte de Budapest, et dira l'histoire a changé, maintenant ça change.
Ionesco has a weariness to him when speaking about his times, perhaps because his interest lied in eternal issues. When talking about issues of death and religion, one finds Ionesco to be much more detailed and open in his commentary. In the deep depth of man, I think man doesn't like his existence. Therefore you find at the end in all the religions that they aspire to present mankind with the image of a paradise, to be alive in that paradise and not to start again a new adventure on earth. And other religions, like for example Buddhism, hope only in a total dissolution of the person, or like in some other religions in the Far East, where people believe in transmigration of the souls, because the life which we are living is unacceptable. This is, in my view, part of the essence of Ionesco, finding the means to come to terms with the terror and fear inherent in death, while also recognising the pain and terror that comes with being alive. Once again, we may recall Itoshiki-sensei, a paradigmatic individual whose feelings of dread when thinking about both living and dying are deeply Ionescian. While Itoshiki may perhaps imagine himself as a Berenger figure, as the only person left in the world willing to stand for what is right, he is a victim of impulse, irrationality and neuroticism as much as his students. These traits are what lead him towards making his long lists of despair-inducing grievances, and this shared trait between the characters is demonstrated when Kafka and others also begin to imitate his moments of despair. This relates to the Bald Soprano, in which the man of speech lacks any sort of naturalistic quality, and instead resembles multiple ongoing and conflicting monologues. This should be immediately familiar to any viewer of Zetsubou-Sensei, whose characters embody a similar trait, speaking in such a manner as to assert their own autonomy and sense of self, rather than in any serious attempt to actually convince others of anything. Zetsubou-Sensei separates itself from a typical sitcom format, which maintains continuity between all of its episodes, as a means to create a baseline situation that can be restarted as one episode ends and another begins. The discontinuity of Zetsubou-Sensei is reflected in its environment, which is aggrandizingly anachronistic, and in its amorphous dialogue, which uses a Ionescian form to create conversations devoid of sensibility, and it further brings this Ionescian quality to a climax with the same approach to an absurdist infinitude found in a Bald Soprano. And finally, reflecting the repetition of a Bald Soprano's ending, we can return to the Zhuangzi once more for a parting comment. I have a huge tree that people call the useless tree. The trunk is swollen and gnarled, impossible to align with any level or ruler. The branches are twisted and bent, impossible to align to any T-square or carpenter's arc. Even if it would have grown right in the road, a carpenter will not give it so much as a second glance. And your words are similarly big but useless, which is why they are rejected by everyone who hears them.